Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. It's hard to believe it's November and Thanksgiving is next week. Welcome to a wonderful night ahead with author Emily Matchar, the author of In the Shadow of the Greenbrier. If we haven't met before, my name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson. By the way, I'm the rabbi at Port Jewish Center, and we are really thrilled to host this conversation with Emily and are grateful to the Jewish Book Council for bringing her to us. I want to just tell you a little bit about our author, and then we'll just begin. So Emily Matchar is a writer originally from North Carolina. As a journalist, she's written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. She did go to school in Boston, if you know what I mean, and spent some time in Hong Kong before eventually landing in Indiana. That's where she lives with her husband and her two sons. We are so lucky to have her with us. As you know, she's the author of In the Shadow of the Greenbrier. And Emily, we're going to just turn things straight to you. Welcome. We're so happy to have you. And if you're here and you haven't shown your face, even just so that Emily knows there's a person behind the name, it would be great for you to just say hello. And then if you want to, you can turn your screen off again. I turn things over to you, Emily. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to get to talk to everybody and to hopefully take some questions at the end if you have any. So I'm going to let me talk for a little bit, and then I've got a presentation with some pictures to show you. But I want to tell you about the name of my book. So the name In the Shadow of the Greenbrier was in fact not the name of the manuscript that I wrote initially. So when I sent the manuscript out, when my agent sent it to various editors that we were hoping might be interested in it, I was just so nervous, so incredibly nervous. I had no idea what was going to happen. Was anyone going to want it? Was anyone going to like it? And I'm waiting, and every day I was living in Hong Kong at the time. So it's 12 hours ahead of the Eastern time in the US. And every morning I'd wake up and I would check my email so nervously. And then one morning there's an email from my agent, Allison, and she says, look, we have an editor and she's interested in it. She has a few ideas for changes, but one initial thing is that she is interested in changing the title. Now, the title that I had come up with was called White Sulphur Springs, which is the name of the town where the Greenbrier Resort is. And I thought it was sort of, an interesting and mysterious title. It didn't really tell you anything about the book. And my editor, the woman who became my editor, she said, the reason I want to change it is because the Greenbrier is really a character in this book. And I think we need to highlight that. And I thought about it and I said, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The Greenbrier really is a character. The Greenbrier is a character in the book. Some of you have read it, and I think some of you haven't. But for those of you who haven't, it's got 4 point of view characters, 4 members of the Zelner family who are living in the West Virginia town of White Sulphur Springs, literally in the shadow of the Greenbrier Resort, throughout the 20th century. But the Greenbrier itself, all of the storyline really stems from things that happen at this resort. So I agreed with my editor. I said, yeah, let's do it. And we did. And I think that was a really good call. But I want to talk to you a little bit about why the Greenbrier is really the 5th character of the book, why it's such an important place that casts such a big shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, are we good? Can everybody see? Okay, fantastic. So the Greenbrier, here's the Greenbrier. I first visited the Greenbrier in about 2006. So I'm from North Carolina, and at the time I'd graduated from college, sort of wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, and was working at a very small newspaper in a small town near where I grew up. And one day, one of my colleagues, who was a friend of mine, she said, let's take a road trip. And because I was 24 years old and I didn't have any responsibilities at the time, I said, sure, great, let's take a road trip. Where do you want to go? And she said, let's go to West Virginia. I said, sure, why not? So we drive up to West Virginia, we see a few things that she wants to see, and then we're staying in some motel in the middle of nowhere, and I start Googling to see what can we see tomorrow before we drive back home. And I see on Google something about this resort called the Greenbrier, and there's a special tour that you can take. Now, because I don't want to spoil some of the ending of the book for some of you who might not have read it and don't know all the historical details of the place, I'm not going to say exactly what this tour was. But what I'll tell you is this. We drive up to the Greenbrier, which is in Greenbrier County, southeastern West Virginia, not too far from the border of Virginia. And you drive sort of into the middle of what feels like nowhere, and then you're going up this long driveway with trees on either side, and then the trees fall away and you see what you're seeing right now. The Greenbrier, this absolutely grand, absolutely splendid, sparkling white resort sitting in this valley in the Allegheny Mountains, and it looks like, you know, like the White House, but if it were 10 times bigger, and all these columns and all of these arches, and it's just incredibly imposing, incredibly impressive, manicured gardens all around. And we park and we go and we take this special tour of a part of the Greenbrier that used to be hidden, that used to be off limits. And the woman who gave the tour, she was a local to White Sulphur Springs, so she had grown up around the Greenbrier, and she had been growing up around the time that they were building this special part of the resort that used to be off limits. And she said something to me, and I'll tell you a little bit later what she said, but what she said to me was so just wild and so fascinating that we left the Greenbrier, and I said to my friend, I said, I'm going to write a novel about that someday. That is such a crazy story. I am going to write a novel about that. And it took me 15 years to get started, but eventually I did it. So let me tell you a little bit more about the Greenbrier. Okay, so here you go, to give you an idea of where it is geographically. It's in that southeastern part of West Virginia, kind of on the border of Virginia, and it's not very far from Washington, D.C., which has been very important to the resort's history. So you can get to D.C. in about, I think, 3 or 4 hours by train. You can get there by car. You can get there. There's an airstrip if you are the kind of person who has a private plane. So the Greenbrier, not the resort as we see it now, but the area has been a destination since about as long as America has been a country. Native people originally would come to the area for the natural springs, and then other people started coming around the late 1700s, and they would take in the waters, the healing waters, to heal their rheumatism or their tuberculosis or whatever disorders they had that really had no genuine treatments at the time. People would go up there and they would bathe in the water, and they would drink this water, which allegedly tastes absolutely revolting, smells like rotten eggs, full of sulfur, but people believe to be very healthful. And originally it was a summer destination that as the 1800s wore on, it became a real see and be seen summer spot for upper class Southerners. So imagine you're a wealthy plantation owner in Georgia, or say you have factories in Memphis or in Atlanta or in Richmond, and you would really rather not stay in those places in the summer. There's a few reasons for that. One reason is that, there's no air conditioning in the 1800s. It's disgustingly hot, and it's full of mosquitoes, and those mosquitoes are carrying things like yellow fever and malaria. So people knew that it was better to go where it was a bit cooler and a bit higher up in elevation during the summer. So these wealthy Southerners, they would come up to the Greenbrier, which at the time was a series of cottages, and it became a destination, and it became known as a place where if you were a rich Southerner, you might be able to find a good young man or young woman for your daughter or your son to maybe get married to. Because maybe if you own a plantation in rural Georgia, your daughter isn't able to meet all that many, proper young fellows who are up to your standards. So the Greenbrier becomes known as a matchmaking destination. People have balls, they play cards, they get involved in all sorts of ways. And so really, if you're anyone in the antebellum South, you would go up to the Greenbrier. Now, it is a hotel that's built there in the I believe 1858 is pretty promptly burned down during the Civil War, but they rebuild it, and it again becomes a destination. And this time it begins attracting an additional crowd. So not just your wealthy factory owners and your wealthy plantation people, but it begins to attract a lot of politicians. And people come down from DC, many presidents, many vice presidents, secretaries of state. I believe something like 28 out of the presidents we've had have stayed at the Greenbrier. So it becomes known as a Washington, D.C. destination. And the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad buys the property in the early 20th century, and they decide to build a year-round resort. And this is when the Greenbrier, as we know it today, gets built. So they build this splendid resort in 1913. This is a postcard. I think the postcard's from the 30s, so a couple decades after the Greenbrier itself opened. And it's attracting the rich Southerners, it's attracting politicians. There are a bunch of golf courses there. It becomes known for that. I'm going to come back to that. And really everyone who's anyone in the 20th century stays there. So you've got, as you can see, these pictures, we've got a bunch of presidents. And then we start getting Hollywood people, probably around the late 40s and the 50s. We start getting Hollywood people. Here's right in the middle, we've got Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher, who spent part of their honeymoon there. Next to them, we've got Princess Grace of Monaco. There's Eleanor Roosevelt. We've got a lot of international dignitaries, Indira Gandhi, all sorts of people are brought to the Greenbrier. So it really has a very sparkling atmosphere. It becomes known as the second White House, some people call it, not only because it looks like the White House, but because politicians and the president spend so much time there. They joke that really they do more business at the Greenbrier than they do in Washington. In 1941, so I say 1942, but it's actually the very end of 1941, they get a new kind of guest. So here's what happens. 1941, December 1941, what happens? Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor happens, America's at war, and all of a sudden, Washington, D.C. has a real problem on their hands. I mean, obviously, they have a bunch of problems on their hands because there's now a war, but they have one very specific problem. And that specific problem is that they now have all of these Italian and German and Japanese diplomats in Washington, D.C., who are now enemies of the state. And you cannot send diplomats nor their families to a regular prison. You can't just have them jailed down the street. That's against all sorts of international laws. But they also could not immediately send them back to the countries where they were from because now a war is happening and we don't have clear transportation lines and we need to figure out some sort of agreement. Well, in the meantime, they need something to do with them. So someone in Washington, D.C. calls up the manager of the Greenbrier in 1941 and says, look, I have a proposal for you. What do you say we turn your luxury resort into a diplomatic prison? How does that sound? And the manager, he could have said no, but he, for a variety of reasons, one of them being that he thought it was his duty as an American citizen, he said yes. And within a couple weeks, all of the ordinary guests were out of the Greenbrier, and train cars start arriving from Washington, D.C. with Italian and German and later Japanese diplomats and their families. So here in this picture, we've got, at the top, we've got the Italian delegation, and at the bottom, we've got the Germans. And if you can see this kind of bald guy right here, down at the very bottom, it's probably a pretty small picture for people to see, but that was Hans Thompson, who was the head diplomat at the time, and he came with his wife Bebe, and they had been known to be socialites in Washington, D.C., and they were famous for really talking out both sides of their mouth about Hitler, because they like to, sort of pull people aside at elegant parties and say, we're not really, into the whole Nazi thing. And apparently they did this because they wanted to keep all of their options open. They wanted to, if things went well for Hitler, they wanted to go back to Germany in glory. And if things went badly, they wanted to be able to stay in the US. So you've got the Thompsons and you've got all the rest of these diplomats, from very high ranking to, people who were basically, secretaries. And they are now detained in the most luxurious prison you can possibly imagine. So these detainees are genuinely treated like ordinary Greenbrier guests. Of course, there is guardhouses around the property, and they're not allowed to leave. They're also not allowed to read the newspaper. But other than that, they are swimming, they are playing bridge, they're eating in the very elegant dining room for all three of their meals, and they're sleeping in beautiful Greenbrier suites on beautiful white Greenbrier sheets. And this certainly rubs some residents of the town of White Sulphur Springs the wrong way. They say, we're living under wartime, conditions, and here are these enemies being treated, being feted, being treated like celebrities. And the manager of the Greenbrier, he said, look, this is what we have to do. This is how you have to treat diplomats, and this is how we hope that they are treating our diplomats. As it turned out, the era of detention only lasted about 6 or 7 months, and by June of 1942, the US had figured out a way to get these diplomats who were detained at the Greenbrier, but also in 2 other luxury Southern hotels, one of which is the Homestead in Virginia, about an hour away, and one of which is the Grove Park in Asheville, North Carolina. All 3 of those places are still there. So they figure out a way in June to get all of these diplomats from all of these resorts back to their respective countries, and which they do, I believe, at least for the Europeans, they ship them to Portugal and dump them there. So the diplomats are gone. The Greenbrier promptly becomes a war hospital, an army hospital. It remains an army hospital throughout the rest of the war. Some people refer to it as the Shangri-La for wounded soldiers, because it's such a splendid place. And if you were a young man and you were shot, on the fields in France, and all of a sudden you were transported back to the US, and now you're being pushed around in a wheelchair on the grounds of the Greenbrier, smelling the roses and flirting with the nurses, you probably feel like you've lucked out in a lot of ways. And even though it was a hospital, it was supposedly a place with a very cheerful atmosphere. A lot of engagements happened there. And then at the end of the war, the Greenbrier management hires a designer from New York called Dorothy Draper to do a total redo of the place. So these pictures you see here, these are images from Dorothy Draper's 19, it was, I believe it was finished in 1948, her late 40s redesign. And at the time, this was considered very cutting edge, very wild. People could hardly imagine decorating a place in these acid greens and these yellows and these melon pinks, and they thought it was a little bit deranged and weren't sure if people were going to like it or not. As it turned out, people loved it. People still love it. Draper really had made a name for herself, and she's done a bunch of hotels. She did some places in Florida, but the Greenbrier is really sort of the crown of her career. And so after Dorothy Draper redesigns it, it goes back to being just this utterly glamorous destination, especially for Hollywood people. And there's a grand reopening, and royalty is there, and movie stars are there, and things keep going along until the Cold War. So 1958, Washington, D.C. calls up the manager of the Greenbrier again. And again, they say, we have something we need your help with. It's going to be a pretty big ask. We're going to need to build something, and it's going to need to be a total secret, and it's going to be really big. And once again, the Greenbrier management said yes. So what they built, I won't say, just in case you don't know and you would like to have this revealed through reading the book. But I will say that the thing that the tour guide told me when I did that first tour of the Greenbrier, the thing she told me was this. She said, look, in the late 50s, when they were building this thing, and they said it was, just an ordinary part of the hotel, we all knew, all of us in White Sulphur Springs, we knew that that was not true. We knew that they were doing something else, and we knew that it was a secret. But here's the thing, we all knew that it was our secret to keep, and that it was our duty to keep that secret. And I just thought when she said that was so wild, that a whole town, it's not a big town, but it has a couple thousand people, this whole town would keep this huge secret together, and they kept it for more than 30 years until it was revealed in the Washington Post in 1992. And when it was revealed, everyone says, it actually had nothing to do with the people of White Sulphur Springs who told the secret. It was somebody in Washington, D.C. who told the secret. So the people of White Sulphur Springs, they kept that secret for more than 30 years. So that inspired me to write a novel, but of course a novel needs characters, not just a hotel. So I started thinking about what kind of characters might interact with the hotel, and I wanted it to be somebody who lived in town, like the tour guide. And then I started thinking, what about a shopkeeper? So I grew up in a Jewish family in North Carolina, and in the town I grew up in Durham, which is a city and has at least now a relatively large Jewish population. But sometimes we'd go to other towns, to visit, and we'd be in these small towns in the South, and I would see a store called, Cohen's, or Morgenstern's, or other sort of typically Jewish names. And I came to learn that it had been very common throughout the 19th and the 20th century for Jewish immigrants to come to small towns in the South and set up stores. And sometimes they would have been the only Jewish family in that town, and sometimes they would have been the only store in the town. So I'm going to talk just a little bit more to give you some background on that, on how these Jewish people came to the South and what it was like for them, to Appalachia specifically. So, okay, when I tell people I wrote a book about a Jewish family in West Virginia, I often get people asking me, oh, what, really? There are Jewish people in West Virginia? And yes, the answer is yes. Not a ton, less now than there used to be, but there are Jews in Appalachia. These are all pictures from West Virginia. Jewish cemetery in the center is a synagogue from Wheeling, West Virginia. On the right, there's a Jewish horse peddler. So Jews have lived in Appalachia since the 1700s. They've had organized communities since the 1840s. They peaked in numbers around 7,000 in the 1950s, and then began to decline, which, the state as a whole also lost population, but the Jewish population declined faster. And how did these Jews wind up in such a place? So the peak of Jewish people immigrating to the US from Eastern Europe was between 1880 and 1920. That's when a lot of Eastern European Jewish immigrants were coming. And it so happens that this coincided with the coal boom in Appalachia. So they're building all these coal mines, they're building these coal towns, they're getting all these people to migrate to West Virginia, and they need people to supply them with stuff. So Jewish immigrants who had, long been part of the chain of being merchants and peddlers, they took on that role. There was a guy in Baltimore called Jacob Epstein. He was a Jewish immigrant from Lithuania, and he opened a place called the Baltimore Bargain House in the later 1800s, and he supplied peddlers with goods to take throughout Appalachia and the rest of the South. And he became one of the richest men in Baltimore, if not the richest, by doing this. So say you're a young Jewish immigrant, you're coming in through Locust Point in Baltimore, and you're immediately going to be met by a recruiter from Jacob Epstein's Bargain House to try to recruit you into being a peddler. And then they're going to send you out into what you might really call the back of beyond. Places that were so remote that a peddler's arrival was very exciting. Here I've got a quote from a woman in Greenbrier County remembering her childhood in the 1880s, and she says that a visit from the Jewish peddler, quote, gave us something to look forward to. It was almost like having Santa Claus come. We loved to see the big bundle opened, for we seldom saw new things. A peddler, he might have, he wasn't bringing food. You had food. He was bringing mostly little luxuries, little things that you need, especially maybe women, wives of the miners might need things like hair combs, things like thimbles, things like eyeglasses, little toys for children, things like that. So people would be excited to see these peddlers, and these peddlers were also often the first and only Jewish people that the people of Appalachia would have come into contact with. Now, of course, you didn't want to stay a peddler for longer than you had to. It was a really hard job, and it was a dangerous job. So what did you do once you had enough money saved up from peddling? Well, often what you would do was you would pick one of the towns that you'd gotten to know through your route, a town that seemed like it was on the up and up and could use a new store, and you would open a store. And they called these places, the people in the towns would often call these places the Jew store. They did not necessarily mean that in a disparaging way, but these were the only Jewish people they had ever met, and they ran the store, so it was the Jew store. And these stores would often start out as simple general stores or dry goods stores, and might over time develop into like bigger department stores. So many of the department stores that we know, or I should say that we knew before department stores really went on the decline, were opened by Jewish immigrants who had started out as peddlers. So then these Appalachian Jewish communities, they had to develop their own traditions because they were far from, large organized, large or even medium-sized organized Jewish communities. One thing that happened was there was this, you can see this bus, this picture, it's the circuit riding rabbi bus. There was a very wealthy Jewish textile magnate from Charlotte, I believe, North Carolina, called Blumenthal, and he funded the circuit riding rabbi bus. And inside the bus, they have an ark, they've got everything. It's a full-on, little temple inside there. And that's a fun example, but there would also be rabbis who just, who drove from town to town, and could, conduct services once a month or could do a bar mitzvah. There would be matchmaking networks where, this boy in this little town in West Virginia needed somebody, and, there wasn't anyone in town. So, hey, there's a girl in this little town in West Virginia. Maybe they would be a good match. And then, of course, laws about about food, rules about food and keeping the Sabbath needed to be modified because you really could not close your store on a Saturday if you're the only shop in a town where you're the only Jew. And you could not necessarily get kosher meat, for example. So people made their own workarounds and did what they felt was okay for what they could access. And these Jews, they were sort of insiders and outsiders. They became often pillars of the community, mayors, city council people, members of fraternal organizations like the Masons. There wasn't a ton of overt anti-Semitism. Most people that I've talked to and read about have said, there wasn't the kind of anti-Semitism that you might have actually gotten in much larger towns because, again, you might be the only Jewish family that people knew and they knew you well. So they knew you as a person and not as a stereotype. I have an anecdote here. A woman in Bluefield, West Virginia, remembers watching a Klan parade, a Jewish woman. She's watching a Klan parade, and a man in the procession in his Klan hood waves at her father and says, "Hey there," because he doesn't get that that's anti-Semitism, that being a Klan's member is means being against the Jewish merchant that he just cheerfully waved to. So it was an interesting tension for people, Jewish people in these small towns in Appalachia. Um, yeah, and then like I said, the numbers of Jews started to decline throughout the 20th century, and now there are only about 2,000 Jewish people in West Virginia, but still many beautiful buildings and interesting stories. So the Zelner family, who you meet in my novel throughout 4 different timelines, they are examples of this sort of slightly lost corner of Jewish history that I just found so fascinating. So that's all for my slide presentation, and what I think we're going to do some Q&A and some questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So will you then just talk a little bit about, just talk a little bit more about the plot of the book in terms of the Zellners, and can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So there are the 4 timelines. So in time order, the characters that we meet are Saul Zelner, who's a peddler, who who is a teenage immigrant from Lithuania who wants to escape the Tsar's army, and he comes from Lithuania to Baltimore and is recruited to work as a peddler in West Virginia, and does that, and then eventually sees a town called White Sulphur Springs, and he hears that this town is about to build a brand new, really big resort, and he thinks that this would be a good place for his shop. So he sets up there, and that starts the roots of the Greenbrier family in White Sulphur Springs. And then the next character that you meet is Sylvia, who is Saul's daughter-in-law. She's a Polish immigrant who has fled Poland in the 1930s, has fled a very comfortable life, and now she is managed to meet Saul's son, and she finds herself in this remote part of West Virginia running a shop, and she's not especially happy about that. And then when the Greenbrier is turned into a detention center, she is recruited to work there, and she winds up becoming involved with one of the detainees. Then the next character that we meet is Sylvia's daughter, Doree, who's your sort of typical American teenager growing up in the late 1950s. And her timeline overlaps with the building of the secret project in the Greenbrier. And so she becomes involved in whatever the secret is and some of the workers that are helping build this secret area. And then the last character is in 1992, and he is Jordan. He is Doree's son, so Saul's great grandson, and he is a reporter at the Washington Post. And his job is to figure out what is the secret at the Greenbrier, and also at the same time he winds up untangling some of these family secrets that have existed for generations in his family. So they're overlapping timelines. You'll go from one character to the other to the other. They're sort of interwoven, and as you read, you discover what some of these secrets and some of these mysteries are.
Thank you. That was perfect summary. So I want to end. I want to turn things over to people who are here who have questions, and I'm going to start with Marcia and Mark. So I always and then if you want to ask a question, if you look on the bottom of your screen, if you're on a computer at least, it should say react, and if you click on that, it'll say raise hand, and you can raise your hand that way, or you can leave me a note in the messages, and I'll know to call on you. But we'll start with Marcia and Mark.
Okay. Hi, thanks so much, especially, the book was great, but also your presentation um, filled in so many gaps in my knowledge about the Greenbrier and about Jews in the South and in Appalachia. Fascinating. A couple of comments that are pseudo-relevant to what your presentation was, and then a question. So another book we had read a few years ago about Jews in the South had a similar story to that coal mining town with the KKK parade and yelling out "Hi Henry" or whatever it was. That there was a little anecdote about some Jewish shoe store owner who saw the KKK people going by in their robes and knew who everyone was by the shoes that he could see underneath, so just reminded me of that. And never made it to the Greenbrier, but my organizations used to have annual meetings there. And from 1935 to 1994, they had 35 annual conferences at the Greenbrier. And then when I started going to the annual meeting, they stopped going there. So I never quite made it. The other thing I was going to mention is my cousin's kid who is in med school in West Virginia. One person she met very early on, finding out that Claire was Jewish, said, "There are still Jews? I thought they were all extinct. I thought that was an old-timey people that didn't exist anymore." This is 3 years ago. This is contemporary. So there's the West Virginia story. My question, you've answered a lot of what I was going to ask, but you have a lot of themes in the book. You have, it's secrets and relationships and the Greenbrier, of course, and the South and Jews and trauma. And I was just wondering if any particular one was what you either started with or think is the core theme that you were trying to impart, because there was so much to this book.
Oh, well, thank you, and thanks for telling those stories. That is wild about about the story about are there no Jews anymore? That's a new one for me. Um, in terms of themes, if I had to pick a central one, I guess secrets would be the central one because the book was inspired by the tour guide telling me that the town kept this secret. And I thought it was so interesting that they all kept a secret. And then I was thinking, sometimes it's good to keep a secret and sometimes it's not good to keep a secret. So the book, there are different secrets and there's different kinds. And some of them are, ones that are clearly unhealthy and are clearly causing real multi-generational harm. And then there's other ones that are kept for really good reasons to protect people. So I wanted to explore that theme of secrecy. So I guess if I did have to pick, that would be the one. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about your writing process?
Sure. So when I finally sat down and said I was gonna really write this, I was gonna really do it. It was early 2020. Now I think everybody remembers what ended up happening in early 2020, and I was living in Hong Kong at the time. And what happened in Hong Kong when the pandemic hit was that they basically closed the border, so it was really difficult to travel in or out. And as a result, we didn't leave for about 2.5 years. We had young, our very young kids at the time. And And so normally I would have done some on the ground research for something like this. I would have gone back to the Greenbrier, you know, and walked around and maybe talked to people, but I wasn't able to do that. So I ended up doing all of my historical research by reading. Fortunately, there's a lot of like really great material about the Greenbrier, including an entire book just on the history of the Greenbrier, because the resort had its own historian for 40 years, a man called Bob Conti, whose entire job was to be the historian. So I had his book. There's a book actually by a guy called Harvey Solomon called Such Splendid Prisons, about the diplomatic detention era. There's books about the Cold War. So I did a lot of reading. And then just in terms of day-to-day writing process, after I had done a bunch of research, I sat down and said, okay, I'm going to write 500 words a day. And that's not a huge amount. It's not nothing, but it's not a ton. But I figured it was something that I could manage every day. And so I did. I knew that I had to actually stick with it. And I knew that if I picked something like 1,000 words, I could probably do it most days, but some days I wouldn't, and then I'd become demoralized. So I just picked a number I thought was achievable, and I stuck to it. And if you write 500 words a day, you know, 5 days a week, before the end of a year, you've got the number of words for a first draft of a manuscript. So that's what I did.
Wow. Thank you. I'm just thinking about how, rethinking how I plan writing my high holiday sermons. And for those people who know me, they know how funny that really is. Okay, I'm going to call on Nancy Solomon now. So I'm going to add her to here. Nancy.
I hope I don't upset the discussion here, but you know, I've done research in various parts of the area that you've worked in Western Maryland, West Virginia. I'm a folklorist.
Oh, wow.
And I have, done a lot of oral histories with people of different backgrounds, including some Jewish families in that area. And I wonder how they're doing in these times. And you being in Indiana, I'm worried about you. These are troubled times. And I was just wondering if you could share with us a little bit about, how Jewish residents are coping, especially after this election.
Well, so I live in a town at the moment called West Lafayette, which is the home of Purdue University. So it's a college town. So it's very, very international. Like my son's kindergarten class has kids from 9 different countries. So I think there are parts of Indiana where I think I would feel more worried to live, but this is not one of them, fortunately. So it's a very welcoming and inclusive community, at least right here.
Thank you. Nancy, do you have a follow-up question, or is that, can I call on the next person? Okay, great. So I'm going to go to Dorothy.
First of all, I loved your book. I really loved it.
Oh.
What I was fascinated about in terms of the Ars Poetica style was there were times in the book where I said, "What? I don't understand. What was that about? What happened there? What was that hidden? What was in the necklace around his neck? What happened?" But you did pull it all together. I was so glad that I stuck it out to see the end of the question. And I wanted to compliment you on that because it was intriguing and it was very much worth the effort to continue. I hope I didn't just spoil something for somebody else. I didn't say what was in it, but it was I thought very well done to have the release of a secret about a birth, a secret about an identity, a secret about a relationship, a secret about what was in a necklace. It was very well handled, and I wanted to compliment you on that.
Well, thank you so much. I realized when I had the question about my writing process, one thing I should have mentioned was that because I wrote a book with 4 different characters that has these various mysteries and sort of details that are revealed at different times, it was a bit tricky to put together. And the way I did write it is I wrote one character at a time, but then I separated their chapters and wove them together. And the way that I ended up doing that was literally just taking a bunch of note cards and giving every character a color of magic marker and writing out their chapters on a note card and then putting them on the floor, like, you know, the crazy detective on the TV show, and like arranging and then trying to figure out, okay, like, does this detail come in at the right time? Like, is this, anyway, so then I put it together and then made my husband read it. So he could tell me if everything made sense. But one comment I sometimes get is that people wish there had been like a family tree, so it would be easier to keep
Yeah.
the characters straight. And I wish I had thought of that before, because I think that would have been a good thing. I like those myself in books, and I often refer to them when I'm reading books so I can keep everything straight. So I should have thought of that.
Very often when I'm reading a book and I see a number of names coming up, I'll go to the beginning, the front page where there's no writing, you know, it's just the title or whatever, and write, you know, John, father of so and so.
Smart.
Yeah, and that was helpful, frankly.
Dorothy, that's such an advertisement for buying books and buying them in paper.
Oh,
In
yes.
paper.
I
Yeah,
write in my books. I have a conversation like the Talmud. I have a conversation with my books. Yes.
that's amazing. My son Solomon actually does the same thing. If you look at any of the novels that he's read, they're all annotated. He just, you know, loves to kind of do that same thing. That's a beautiful thing, Dorothy. Thank you. I'm going to turn things over to Camille, who also has a question.
Hi. Hello. Dorothy, great tip on that. I'm going to be doing that. Um, Emily, in many ways you've already commented on the question I put into the chat. I'm going to read it, but then sort of segue from it because you could answer either part. The question was, I felt that the word shadow reflected the shadow side of life experienced by the Jewish characters living with different types of Jewish identity in a non-Jewish setting. Would you say that the idea of generational trauma influenced your sense that there were secrets burdening the characters? And you kind of commented on that, but then the follow-up would be, and maybe this is wherever you want to start, since you grew up Jewish in a place that's not known for that community, I'm curious what it caused you to reflect about yourself and what secrets may or may not have been kept.
Yeah, oh, those are both really good questions. And yeah, I'd never really thought about like what the word shadow might have meant. You know, I mean, I think I was thinking of it in the sort of the metaphorical sense of, you know, like living that close to the hotel, but also being sort of, shadowed by it because it was such a big thing. So yeah, in terms of generational trauma is definitely something that was not a phrase that was in my mind when I was writing it, but afterwards, like, made a ton of sense. Because you have these people, especially, my character, Sylvia, she's the one who's the refugee who's fled Poland, fled the Nazis in the late 30s. And she, because of some of the things she's experienced and what's happened to her family, is really unable to be the kind of parent that maybe she otherwise would have been. And so some people look at her character and they go like, oh, she's awful and she's a terrible mother. And I just think about what she's experienced, and how she got that way. And I do have like a lot of sympathy for her because she's operating under something so traumatic and something so much larger than herself. Like, of course, she's not able to, because of that and because of her own temperament, is not able to rise above it in the way that you might wish that she would. So yeah, those are a good question. And then, I mean, yeah, I thought so you can see, actually, if you see behind me, there's a painting of a woman, that's my grandmother. although I will say, I have no knowledge that she ever did anything interpersonally like my character Sylvia did. I did lift a lot of the biographical details of the character Sylvia from my grandmother,
Hmm.
because my grandmother was also from the town of Łódź in central Poland, and she was also raised in a comfortable, home. Her father owned some sort of textile factory, and they were so comfortable and so ensconced in the community there that they also, like Sylvia, did not leave until it was almost too late, and then wound up being split between, what was then British Mandatory Palestine and the United States. And like Sylvia, she, because of some of the things she experienced, and because she then wound up in a difficult marriage that she might not have made if she had had more choices at the time, was also somebody who had a hard time and wasn't able to, be her best self. And I also, think I thought about that. I thought about her a lot, and I thought about, what that must have meant for her. And I was also separated from my family when I wrote it, but in a, because of the pandemic and being, in Hong Kong. But we could, we could talk and we could FaceTime, and it made me really reflect on what that must have been like for my grandmother, separated from her own family by an entire ocean during a war, with no way to talk, no way to communicate, but these airmail letters that might or might not arrive, and just how incredibly difficult that must have been for her. Just really something unimaginable to someone of my generation. Yeah, good questions. Thank you.
Well, sure. Just a comment on that. I mean, to me, she was the most interesting character in that she wasn't obviously someone we would feel empathy for, and yet she was the pivotal character, I think, in terms of the plot, for her influence on the next generations. And it's interesting to hear you bring her up in relation to your grandmother, who, in a way, might be giving you breadcrumbs into your own path here in Jewishly. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
Rabbi, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
I know, I'm muted. Sorry about that. So I I just said, I didn't mean to replace you with me, but I meant to add myself. That being said, what's so interesting, I mean, there are lots of interesting things, but the subject of Jewish life in the South is one that I don't know if it fascinates Jews in the South, but certainly Jews in the North, and New York Jews are, and people here are not all from New York actually, but are fascinated by Jewish life in the South, and because there's so much history, and we've been, in the South for so long, and there's just it almost seems miraculous, right? That we continue to be there. And I have a friend who is a rabbi in West Virginia.
Wow.
That's been her only pulpit for the last 19 years, I think. And I'm sure she's a nice Jewish girl from New Jersey,
Uh-huh.
and ended up becoming a rabbi in maybe in Wheeling, West Virginia. I have to look it up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so she's been there, all these years, and I think really loves being there.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy, but I think it's really meaningful work. And there are still, as you probably know, I think it's the Center for Jewish Life, or Center for Southern Jewish Life. There are actually still traveling rabbis in the South. The Reform movement literally sends rabbis to congregations, once a month still, so that they can allow those congregations to continue to exist and have access to rabbis for all the things you described. So such a good also history that you started with, and thank you for that. I want to be sensitive to time, but I do see Miranda has her hand up, so we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap things up.
I'll be very quick. I found it fascinating to look at the need for assimilation when you're the only Jewish person in town, and like Saul's decision to stop wearing a yarmulke, and how hard it must be, when you don't have a synagogue and you're relying on a traveling rabbi to teach your children and to stay Jewish. It's much harder than when you're up north and there's, you could probably walk to your synagogue.
Yeah, no, I thought about that theme a lot and how different it was for, for Saul versus for his granddaughter Doree in the 50s when, all she wanted was to be normal, like a girl in 17 magazine, and yet her Jewish identity was important to her. And then her own son Jordan, who was raised in a heavily Jewish suburb of Baltimore and surrounded by a Jewish community, but also was, getting all of these lessons about assimilation, and he and his sister sort of took these lessons on board in very different ways. So yeah, it's obviously it's a theme that Jewish people have been grappling with ever since we came to America or started leaving wherever we came from.
So I want to be sensitive to the time. Before we conclude, I know before this our talk, you had mentioned that you have you have a second book in the works, and you're starting on your third book. So can you just tell us about what's coming up next for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it hasn't been officially announced, so it's still slightly secret. No, 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 no. I didn't mean that like that. It is absolutely fine. I will tell you. I just haven't made the announcement on my Facebook page or anything like that, but I'm happy and excited to talk about my second book because I did just sell it. And it is got a lot of similar themes. So it's about a Jewish family in the South. This time it's during the Great Depression, and it's in New Bern, North Carolina, which is a part of North Carolina. I see that some people are familiar. It's sort of the Tidewater area of North Carolina, not quite at the beach. And New Bern, back in the earlier part of the 20th century, had a big enough Jewish community that an area of downtown was known as Little Jerusalem. So I have a family that runs a business in Little Jerusalem in New Bern, and the daughter of the family, who has sort of just been through a traumatic past couple of years, she discovers an unconscious woman behind her family's business and has to take it upon herself to help this woman and figure out where she's from and what she needs, even though this woman doesn't speak. So it's again, it's got an element of mystery to it. It's about Southern Jews. So hopefully if you enjoyed In the Shadow of the Greenbrier, you'll enjoy this one. And it should be out hopefully in the spring of 2026 is what we're looking at. It is a long headway between when you sell the book and when it actually comes out.
That's amazing and exciting, and we're thrilled for you. I think you have a lot of people looking forward to hearing about it, to reading it when it comes out. So I just want to remind everyone that the book is called In the Shadow of the Greenbrier by Emily Matchar. Emily, we want to thank you. One way people can thank Emily for being with us, and Marcia's holding it up, is write a review on Goodreads or write a review on Amazon, or do both. And Hanukkah's coming up. It's a great gift. So let people know that you read the book. Let people know that it's a great story. You can also send them a copy of this talk. It'll be posted on YouTube soon enough, and hopefully we can help in that way. Thank you so much, Emily, for everything. We're so appreciative of you spending your time with us. I just want to let people know that we have two talks coming up. One on December 4th with Rossi, who's the author of the Punk Rock Queen, she's the author of the Punk Rock Queen of the Jews, a memoir. And then on December 18th, The Last Ships from Hamburg, Business, Rivalry, and the Race to Save Russia's Jews on the Eve of World War I by Stephen Ujifusa. But again, tonight's book is called In the Shadow of the Greenbrier by Emily Matchar. Go get it and write a review. Thanks, everybody, and have a great Thanksgiving. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.